Setting timers, downloading apps, standing desks, getting up at 5 a.m. A new week, a new productivity hack. But is chasing productivity actually helping us to get more done, or simply giving us more to do? What does it really mean to be productive? Today, we answer the big question, what's the secret to doing our best work?
Productivity is not just a mathematical formula, which it has often been seen as. I think it's much wider than that.
The research shows that if people are doing these things, then they are not only experiencing more joy in the workplace, but also performing better.
I think there are enough and more examples to say that if deployed correctly, it makes life easier for you and me, the common person.
I think change is happening everywhere, more and more frequently. And what we're asking workers to do is cope with, adapt to that change.
Hello and welcome to the Green Room by Deloitte. I'm Ollie Carpenter and today I'm joined by the wonderful Steph Dobbs. How are you, Steph?
Good, Ollie. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good, thank you. Whether it's ticking off chores, pursuing our hobbies or performing well in our careers, there's no denying that being productive matters to us. And it matters to the businesses we work in too. So how can we find ways to get more done in a way that works for everyone? Today we're answering the big question. What's the secret to doing our best work? As we explore our relationship with productivity, what we really need in order to get more done, and how businesses can improve productivity in a way that works for us all. So Steph, I'm looking forward to a very productive conversation on today's pod.
The puns have started.
Yeah, so who's joining us today?
Thanks, Ollie. And so today we are joined by Professor Mike Clinton, who is Professor of Work Psychology at King's College London. Welcome, Mike.
Hi there.
And we are also joined by Shivani Mitra, a partner in Deloitte's Human Capital practice. Welcome, Shivani.
Thank you.
Right, so Mike, let's perhaps start with you in terms of questions. There's no better place, I think, really to start than actually talk about how we actually define productivity. So can you define it for us? And then also, can we perhaps think about, does it differ between how we use that word as an individual or as businesses?
Yeah, so that's a really good place to start. I think the difficulty with productivity is there's so many different ways of thinking about it. So we can think about the outputs produced, we can think about the inputs put into work, but it very much varies from place to place, context to context. So what productivity is at a company like Deloitte is very different to what you might think about productivity being in a school or a hospital. And we can also think about from individuals. So we can all probably think about ourselves as being more or less productive on a day-to-day basis. But that may be quite different if we think about what makes an organisation productive, or even productivity at the economy level.
Makes sense. And Shivani, can we perhaps think then about how understanding of productivity has perhaps so changed over time?
It's interesting how you defined productivity, Mike, because I think that's the key. It is so variable across different contexts that I think the concept of value has become important, right? So it's no longer about hours. It's no longer about how many tasks you're ticking off. It is either at an individual level or a team level and eventually a more community level. What is the value you're producing? And what is the role human potential plays in defining that value? And I think that is how the definition has been evolving over a period of time.
Mike, I think it's true to say you've done some research around productivity and well-being and how they intersect. And nowadays we often look at that link between the two. So why does being and feeling productive matter to us?
So the idea that how we feel and how well we perform are linked, that idea has been around for a long time. There's this classic hypothesis called the happy worker hypothesis, that the more happy we are, the better we perform. And the nature of the relationship is from happiness going to productivity. As research has been done, there's no doubt a connection. And I think there's certainly a common sense understanding that these things are connected. But in a lot of the data, what you see is that, interestingly, the link between performance and well-being is almost stronger. So we all feel fantastic when we perform well. And it's really interesting that these kind of ideas exist together. And I think the good thing is it's a win-win. So if we're feeling good, we tend to be performing well. And if we're performing well, then we feel really good about it.
And Shivani, for you, in the context of business, why is productivity so important? And what can businesses gain if they can really harness that?
It is linked to your shareholder value. the contribution you're making to your immediate and wider community. But I think there's a very direct link in the way your brand is perceived, right? A happy worker is more productive, and that immediately reflects on the service your customer, your end consumer is getting, and the role therefore you're playing more widely in society. So productivity is not just a mathematical formula, which it has often been seen as. I think it's much wider than that, and it's the role an organization plays in society overall that's quite important to acknowledge.
And so I suppose very clear then that productivity is important to us and also to businesses, but it also seems like we're constantly pursuing it, and the statistics are obviously showing that things have actually slowed in recent years. So Shivani, let's come to you first. Can you give us a bit of an insight into perhaps the reasons for that, and maybe explain what we actually mean by this productivity puzzle we hear about?
Yes, and when I was preparing for this conversation, also because I'm sitting next to a professor, I thought I might as well do some homework. Since the last financial crisis of 2008, productivity has been steadily falling, especially in the advanced economies, but also in the emerging economies of the world. And currently it's under 2%, right? And that's a really low figure. Why is that happening? I think there are 2 or 3 main reasons. I think the biggest reason is we haven't come across a stable period of time for long enough for things to stabilize and know what we are going to do. So leadership across organizations, if I were to look at it in the concept of business, they are just grappling with one thing after another. So I guess that's one. The second is either there hasn't been adequate technological advancement, and if there has been, the adoption hasn't been great. And there is a social mobility gap around that we must think about there. And the third is the question, are organizations investing enough in people development, right? So you could have the best technology, but if it's not augmenting your human skills and people are not adopting that technology and also are not learning continuously, it is going to impact performance, productivity. And then, are management practices really catching up with the asks of the workforce? I mean, we do a Gen Z millennial survey every year, and year after year, the themes are starting to get pretty consistent. Are organizations reacting to that? Are they doing anything with that? Or are they just saying, I need to show green on my balance sheet, and that's what's going to drive me, without looking at it in the longer term? So those are some of the reasons, in my view, productivity is not where it could be, potentially.
Sure. And is that just an issue in the UK, or is it an issue elsewhere as well?
I think it's global. It's very much a global issue, yeah.
I think change is happening everywhere, more and more frequently. And what we're asking workers to do is cope with, adapt to that change. And that really is requiring them to be ambidextrous, to focus on what they need to do today, but also keep half an eye on what they might need to do tomorrow and what they might need to do the week after. So it's a very difficult, challenging world people face at the moment.
And what about the measurement then of productivity from a business perspective? Is there an easy way to do that, or is it a multifaceted approach we need to take?
I would suspect it's a multifaceted approach. It's very easy to say, let's bring in agile working practices and implement, OKRs across the organization. The reality is OKRs don't apply in every context. So it's not applicable to every function. They're not applicable to every team. But then there's a discipline around it. I think the way in which you measure employee engagement varies considerably. That is also a measure of productivity. Of course, how you're performing in the market is often seen as, how well you're doing, etc. But there are multiple factors. And again, the problem is you're taking one lens view of things. It has to be a multifaceted approach to how you're looking at productivity.
Yeah, I'd agree completely with Shivani there. The really good measures of productivity I've seen are balanced scorecard type approaches. And there it really acknowledges the multifaceted nature of productivity, but also that there are trade-offs between different dimensions of productivity, and you can do one thing really well, so you can really focus on quantity, for example, but then quality may suffer. So really, trying to achieve everything, I think it's a bit of a fool's errand, really. So the more we can kind of think of it as that balanced scorecard approach, I think the better.
Makes sense. And of course, we can often experience these like productivity bursts, for example. So extreme flurries of activity that push a project forwards. Personally, my 3 p.m. coffee means the rest of the day is very productive for me. But, and please tell me this, honestly, is that actually a sustainable way of working? So is it actually part of a productivity cycle, or is there actually a more sustainable way of achieving?
I think this is a very set of interesting questions. I don't have the answer, but I think what I do know is there's this idea of peak performance that I think we're all trying to get towards. I think we probably need to acknowledge that being able to achieve peak performance every single day, almost by definition, is not possible. About 10 years ago, I started doing daily diary studies. So really asking people on a daily basis how things were going, how well they were performing. And one of the really interesting findings there that has really kind of reflected on as time has gone by is that the biggest predictor of whether someone had a good day was having a bad day the previous day. And I kind of initially thought that was a little bit of an anomaly within the data and didn't do much with it. But it's the idea that we are all reflecting on how well we're doing, how well things are going, compared to perhaps our recent experiences. So if we have a good day one day, maybe we'll have a less good day the following day, and that's just the natural cycle of things.
And I think that speaks to your work on the double-edged sword nature of productivity, right? And how does that have an effect on workers?
Well, I've become interested in this because I think for a long time there was really a very positive push with the idea that there are a lot of win-wins out there, that you could be productive, really productive, hit that peak performance, and also experience huge levels of well-being and so on. And the more I looked into that, the more I found that actually for many people that wasn't really the case. They could perhaps have peak performance for a period of time, but that was maybe temporary. In order to achieve that, they'd have to invest sacrifices, give up things, personal costs and things like that. So I wonder whether for many people, many contexts, it's more of a zero-sum game. So yes, you can perform incredibly well, but we have to accept this comes at a cost to ourselves.
So let's maybe talk about some differences in perception between management and employees when it comes to, perhaps seeing productivity in different ways. Shivani, should I come to you first?
Yeah, so there's some research LSE Center of Economic Performance has done, and there is a positive correlation between productivity and management practices. However, the interesting bit is, again, as part of this research, when they spoke to British bosses or managers, 88% feel that their workforce is quite productive. But when you flip the question around to the workforce, to the employees, almost 80% feel they are not productive. And this gap is costing the British economy billions every year.
So let's maybe think about how we improve things. So Shivani, let's come to you first. From a personal perspective, perhaps, what do we actually need to know about ourselves in order to become productive as individuals?
It's very important to understand what gives you energy. I've been talking to so many of my clients, and most of them are consumer businesses, but around culture and culturally, what is it that they want to achieve? And the number of clients who've come back and said, that feeling of joy and happiness at the workplace is becoming increasingly important to them. So people can get energy when they walk into the workspace, and the workspace gives them that sense of purpose and fulfillment is important. And one could argue it's a generational thing. I mean, again, our survey tells us that having that sense of purpose and getting energy out of that is very, very important to a younger workforce. But I was having breakfast with a colleague this morning who's Gen X just like me, and I asked him, what gives you energy? And he said, knowing that in my day I'm going to achieve something that's important to me gives me energy. So that sense of purpose, happiness, fulfillment is extremely important. And organizations have to acknowledge it and find a way that in the normal warp and weft of work, how you can bring in that sense of joy, of purpose, to give your people energy that eventually leads to higher productivity. That's really, really critical. The second thing I want to touch on very quickly is creating that secure, safe workplace. And we've heard about this concept of, people being able to bring their whole self into the workplace. We do spend 60-70% of our week working. And if you are pretending to be someone else, or you're not able to fully acknowledge how you're feeling, I'm not feeling 100% today, or I'm feeling very stressed today, being able to acknowledge it. And, we have to thank Gen Z specifically for being bold enough and being brave enough to talk about mental health at the workplace, because again, that empowers you, and then you will be able to deliver to the best because you've been very honest first with yourself and those who you're working with. So that's the second bit. The third thing is your work practices. The debate around hybrid working is going to go on for a bit longer, and I don't want to dwell on it too much. But the optionality, the flexibility, and then having the right technology to collaborate and work with your colleagues, can't ignore the importance. It is going to become more and more important. So those are the top three I would focus on.
And Mike, we're regularly bombarded, certainly I am when I sort of look through various social media sites, for example, with productivity hacks and ways to improve our working day, or things that we can do in our personal life to really, motivate ourselves, make ourselves feel better and generally be more productive. But are there any tips or hacks that actually work for everybody?
Well, I'm not sure it would be classed as a hack. I've been doing some research on this idea of job crafting, which has been around for 20 or more years, and speaks to many of the things that Shivani was raising there. Job crafting essentially is when organisations allow their employees to make small bottom-up changes to their work. So it could be altering the things you do very slightly, maybe kind of dropping that really mundane, boring, pointless task that you are doing every day towards something a bit more meaningful. It could be developing a relationship with somebody that gives you that sense of purpose, or perhaps dropping that relationship that does the opposite. Or it could even be just changing the way you think about your work and different aspects of your work to really reconnect with perhaps the reason why you started doing that job in the first place. Now, this sounds simple, it takes time, but the research shows that if people are doing these things, then they are not only experiencing more joy in the workplace, but also performing better.
I'd be keen to get your thoughts on this. Shivani, I'll come to you first. When it comes to process-driven work that we do, there's arguably quite a lot that people do in their day-to-day that could be maybe simplified or standardised, but sometimes that impetus isn't there. Are there ways around that? Are there ways that we can do that to help improve productivity and also improve well-being as well?
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons there is a productivity issue is because of the complexity, the inherent complexity that exists within all our organizations. And, over the past few years, we have seen more and more focus and investment in shared services, because you take away everything that can be done in one way, away from, the day-to-day. So do that. I think structures can be simplified, how you work in teams, how you report back, how you get stuff done needs to be really simplified, and how you're submitting information, how you're getting information, a little bit of investment in that to simplify. And the number of clients I've spoken to who start with, I want to simplify things here because it's costing me money, is, quite a bit.
Absolutely. I think that would be welcome with everybody, right?
With everyone, exactly. Yeah.
Mike, any thoughts?
Well, I think the human factor there, I think really often when you speak to people about why systems are so complex, people have the answers, or at least they may have half of the solution, but they're never asked, and their opinions never really kind of brought forward. So I think, really don't discount the human in the technological system.
Scope is one of the national charities Deloitte supports through pro bono, funding and volunteering as part of our social impact programme, 5 Million Futures. And now you can channel your inner shopper to do good by shopping at any of Scope's retail or online stores. Their work towards creating an equal future for disabled people is inspiring. Every pre-loved item you purchase or donate will help fund Scope's vital services for disabled people and keep millions of items out of landfills. Just visit scope.org.uk to find out more. Shivani, you touched on this before, but what role does where we actually do the work have on our productivity? As you say, there's obviously lots of discussions about hybrid working and that continues, but how much does that piece around where we actually choose to work have an impact?
It does. I mean, if I talk to some of our working parents, for instance, the choice they have to work from home, let's say 2 to 3 days a week, really empowers them, because you are no longer guilty about missing that 9 a.m. call because you were doing a school drop off, or running off at 4:30 because you have to do the pickups, because working from home is allowing you to be at that meeting, not feel guilty about abandoning your colleagues, but do also what's required of you as a parent. So it's not so much about where you work, but the choice you have that you can work from where you need to work when you need to work from that place. I mean, personally for me, I don't have children. I have a goldfish for a pet, so there's not much of a responsibility at home. But I can tell you that being able to work from home on a Monday, that's very energizing and makes me very productive. And it's a choice I have, and that choice gives me energy. So it's relative, but I don't think it's about the location as much as it is about having that choice.
And then what about technology? Because we'd be remiss not to talk about the impact of technology. It's everywhere. It can make us more efficient, but it can also distract us as well. So what benefits can technology bring in terms of productivity, and what should we be wary of as well?
I think technology allows us to organise our time better. I think one of the potential problems of technology, and particularly linked to the home working kind of growth in that practice, is the possibility it gives us to be just always on, always contactable, always at the end of a phone or an email or message or whatever. So I think really a key thing for people's well-being, a lot of robust evidence around this is around the need to detach at the end of days, over the weekends, and the more we can really create those boundaries and separations between work and non-work, the better. And I think one of the potential problems, amongst all of the other wonderful things technology allows us to do, is that it does interfere a little bit and makes that boundary more permeable.
Mm. Sure. And Shivani, if we zero in then on AI as one example, again, it would be remiss for us not to talk about it. It can help us to work quickly, but do you think there's more to do in terms of upskilling people to use it more effectively?
So I remember doing this talk some time ago, and my biggest fear about Gen AI, as it is about any technology, is that we have a real social mobility gap in the country and also globally. I think as a society and as organizations, we have a responsibility to create an even playing field. And technology can help create that, but it can also exacerbate the gap. So acknowledging and recognizing that is quite key. I also want to say that Gen AI's purpose should be to augment human skills, not replace it, unless we're talking about very mundane tasks that you were referring to, Mike. So, and we've spoken about this concept of bigger, better jobs for a really long time. And at least what our research is saying, what the World Economic Forum research is saying, is that kids in school today will do jobs that don't even exist. So I don't think the worry should be about technology replacing us completely. It's just that jobs will look different. And at the very start, I'd said that when you asked me the question about the productivity puzzle, we need to really focus on and invest in development of human skills. We shouldn't get carried away with the new shiny object that is technology sitting on a shelf and say, I must adopt it. Technology for technology's sake, because it looks exciting, is dangerous. We should know how we're going to use it, where it's applicable, and be very sure the role it's playing in augmenting the human side of things and not completely replacing it in that sense.
Makes sense. And I suppose in terms of then some organisations like the public sector, for example, that have much more limited resources, what role could technology perhaps play in augmenting productivity in that sector?
I don't know a great deal about this. I don't know whether anyone at this point in time really has a good idea about what's going to happen next. But an analogy that makes sense to me is the comparison with the impact of sat navs on taxi services, where all of a sudden that your knowledge of the streets of London no longer carried the same value that it used to have, really reduced the barrier to entry into that world of work. So I think if AI and Gen AI in particular can reduce barriers to entry, I think that's a very good thing and will bring new people into the labour market and into organisations that previously could not. But I think there is always that gap between what at the moment what Gen AI can do and what a professional or individual with expertise can do. And I think that still has value add.
Sure. And Shivani, maybe that sort of broader question then about the impact technology can have in the public sector. Have you seen any examples of where it can boost productivity, perhaps?
I think, if you just look at the passport office, which has transformed in the last few years, and the speed at which they respond, and because technology has been deployed in such a great way, customer service has become better. Right? I think that's a great example that, you're deploying technology in the right way, but not taking away the human element, which we inevitably need in interactions with the public sector, is a really good example. I think the DVLA is doing something similar. I think there are enough and more examples to say that if deployed correctly, it makes life easier for you and me, the common person who's using those services, but also enhances the human side of things.
So it's a fine line to tread then, really, in terms of getting that balance right. And we spoke earlier about the link between productivity and well-being, but what can leaders do to help embed and develop cultures and working practices that deliver results but also look after their teams?
I think for me, the concept of leadership is never static, it's constantly evolving. And in today's world, there are 3 or 4 givens for a leadership team. I think first of all, creating the right environment. We talked about safety, security, but as leaders being more decisive, taking on greater accountability, that's really, really key. Empowering your teams and allowing them to have their own subcultures because it just works for them, and being advocates of that culture is really critical. Leading from the front. I think the days of command and control and completely centralized structures will not work today, especially if we look at the workforce coming. Gen Z is 20% of the workforce and growing. That sort of command and control will not work in the Gen Z mindset. So very accessible leadership, focus on creating value for your employees rather than extracting value from your employees. That flip needs to happen. And just that constant recognition that leadership is no longer just a title. It's much more than that. It needs to be all pervasive across all levels and to encourage that.
And I suppose then Shivani, we'll come to you first on this one, but in terms of if businesses are actually looking to, improve their productivity, what would the first step be? Where do you start with a big puzzle like that?
Empower your teams, empower the individual. People come to work with a sense of purpose, energize them, and they will deliver. Learn to trust them, so empower them.
Start there. And how do you start that conversation with a business leader? How do you, when you move into the client room, where do you start having that conversation in terms of empowerment?
I'll give them examples. I'll give them examples of 3 or 4 organizations that have turned around in the past, I think, 2 or 3 years. And when you speak to the CEO, they start with bringing about culture change. For me, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Listen to the guys who've done it, and they start with culture. That's my opening line.
And Mike, as individuals, what do we start doing tomorrow to be more productive?
Well, I think that there's kind of a romantic answer to that question, which I semi-believe in, which is find a thing that you love doing or find really important to do, and doing that kind of work is not difficult. As in, you will just naturally want to do well, you'll find energy to do it, and it will just be a joy. I think the reality often is that either that work is difficult to find, or even if we are really aiming for that peak performance, then I think there needs to be a realism that will involve some sacrifices, that will involve an investment of self and other important things that you value, and acceptance of that. Hopefully it's temporary. If you can build in enough support and other resources around it, if you can factor in recovery times, and hopefully, I think the biggest thing, if you can attain success, then I think that becomes sustainable. But I think, be realistic if you're really aiming high.
There's a great speech by Roger Federer, which he gave at some university convocation after he retired. And he shared a very interesting statistic that through his career, he's one of the greats, if not the GOAT, as you guys call the greatest, is that he lost 50% of the points he played. And that for me, the penny drops that we need to embrace failure as well. We are so caught up in this being successful and not failing and not making mistakes. Listen to that speech is what I'll say.
Oh, that's really good. I think, but making friends with failure, I think that's absolutely essential. And maintaining that optimism. Like I said at the beginning, the link between performance and well-being is perhaps stronger than the other way around. So when you are failing, the quick thing is to feel awful about it. But I think leaders, again, can create that culture where you can encourage people to fail and maintain that safety.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story about Roger Federer. I hadn't heard that one before. I think I'd fail much more than he does on the tennis court, though, for sure. So, yeah. Well, we're very, very quickly coming to the end of the podcast, but we always like to bring it back to the big question. So we'll ask you both, but Mike, if I come to you first, what's the secret to doing our best work?
I think there's no real secret. I think it is, if you can find that thing you love doing or find really important, then your best work will follow. Otherwise, it is just putting the effort in and working really hard.
Fantastic. And Shivani?
That, plus one thing I say to anybody who's starting off in their career is find your tribe at work. Find people who will give you energy, who will be your sounding board, who you can be vulnerable in front of, but will create that safe environment. So find your tribe, I think is the best way to say it. Work on finding and nurturing that, because at least for me, in the last 26, 27 years of my career, that has been invaluable.
I love that. And what a great message to end on. Well, Shivani, Mike, thank you so much for joining us in the green room today.
Pleasure. I think it was productive.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question. So don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. That way, you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad. Original music by Ali Barrett.